But what does it take? What does it take to become, to be somebody? And not just somebody, but you might need to add the word a there, right? To be a somebody. What is it? Is it a certain level of popularity and fame? It used to be that if you got any appearance on TV, and you could tell your grandchildren about the day you got on TV, and maybe you just were in the background of some news footage or something, right? But you had your moment of fame, and we talk about our 15 minutes of fame, and there's some fascinating history behind that. But is it popularity and fame? Is it just success in business or in career? Is it when you reach a certain level in the tax bracket, or sometimes, you can play with that. You don't want to go too far at sometimes. But, what is it? Is it in education? It's when you finally get that one degree you chased, or you can put doctor or MD or whatever it is behind your name, and then maybe other people say, or even you can look at yourself and go, now you've arrived. Now I'm somebody. Or I guess if you're talking to yourself in the mirror and that evening, you say, now you're somebody for real. What does it take to become a somebody? Instead of what no one wants to be is what? A nobody. All right? See, I chose my words carefully there. I didn't say nobody wants to be a nobody. That'd be too much nobodiness. But no one wants to be just a nobody. Now let's take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And we're just going to leave that question floating out in the cyberspace of our brains or something like that. But 1 Corinthians chapter 1 opens after the initial greeting in 1 Corinthians 1 through 9. It opens with a problem. Like many of the letters written to these ancient churches, part of the reason the Holy Spirit inspires the apostle to write is because there is something amiss that needs correcting, there's a missing piece of the puzzle, something that is problematic and needs some inspired solution. The problem, in a word, is disunity. It's a discussion of unity, and that's the backdrop, as we're going to call it, if you're looking at the handout, the backdrop context or the prior context that leads up to where we're going to dig in a bit more this evening. But in verses 10 through 17, the Apostle Paul makes his appeal to unity in verses 10 through 13 with some questions, rhetorical questions thrown in verse 13. And then he looks at what he has heard about the problem, in verses 14 and 15. And then he makes some observations and makes one observation about his purpose in verse 17 that, by the way, has been, I say, really it still is used. You can find it pretty often in our religious world. It's used to teach against the idea that being immersed into Jesus is essential for salvation. Why? Because in 1 Corinthians 1:17, the Apostle Paul says, Jesus didn't send me to baptize people. And out of context, that is frequently used to support the idea, well, then baptism may be of some importance, but it's not that important because Paul wasn't about baptism. He's just about preaching the gospel. Now, again, if you read it in context, the point is not about baptism's importance. It's, if anything, it's about the importance of the person who is the baptizer. And even bigger than that, it's about who you really follow, isn't it? Are you following Jesus with everybody else, and apostles and preachers and elders included? Or is there some kind of system of hierarchy that leads to division among God's people? That's the backdrop to this part now in 1 Corinthians 1:18 through 2:5. The Corinthians lived in a world where people traveled around and they were known as the wisdom sharers. Might be one way of how we would translate it in English. They were the orators and the philosophers, and they went around and made their living by gathering followers. They did this either by showing up to a new area, a new town, and they had a novel message, and they would gather the locals while they were there for weeks or months, and the locals would support them, and they were their followers. followers. Or they might even follow from town to town. If they could get enough devoted followers who would enjoy listening to them, when they moved on, their followers might as well. That's the system that many of the Corinthians were familiar with. And Paul says that's not how it works with Christianity. Now take a look with me at verses 18 and following now. As he states that the reality of what he is about and what we should be about is the message of the cross. It's the gospel, preaching the gospel. He then gives more explanation of what that looks like, what it doesn't look like, the problem that some have when they look at the gospel. And so this evening, in this section, let's notice seeing the gospel in verses 18 through 25. How I see the cross, it changes everything. Seeing the cross or the gospel. And then my boast or boasting in the cross. And then 1 through 5 of chapter 2 will almost serve as an extended conclusion this evening, proclaiming the cross. Let's take a look at that first one in 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 25, seeing the cross. And then out beside those three phrases, you might notice there are some empty key words. And you can think of this as if you want to remember three phrases, you can do that. It's a little more work. Or you can just try to remember or hold on to three words. The first word this evening is conversion. Conversion. Because the way I see the cross, one, that changes whether I will be converted to the Christ of that cross. But that whole process of being converted, that continues to change the way I see things. The way I see Jesus and his cross, the way I see you, the way I see how the world works, how things operate. It's all about the way I see, in this case, primarily the way I see the cross. Let's notice the first few verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning at verse 18 now. He says, and he's already stated that he doesn't preach the gospel with words of eloquence. That's not the point, or eloquent wisdom. And you can even read that as not a word of eloquent wisdom in verse 17. And now he says, for the word, or the message, but there's a nice parallel here, or really contrast, right? There's the word of eloquent wisdom in verse 17. That's how the world operates. Make it sound wise and appealing. But the gospel, he says, the word of the cross then is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, notice that both are ongoing process, or are an ongoing process. It is the power of God. What a difference that makes. Seeing something differently. I was reading about the Hubble telescope. Now, let's do this. How many of you remember when it was launched? Anybody remember that? It was April 24th, 1990. I don't remember it, okay? And there's a reason for that. And if you want to know the reason, ask me later, right? But it was released, and then just about 2 months later, it's June 27th of 1990, NASA had to announce that there was a problem. The Hubble Space Telescope had a major manufacturing flaw. And when you read some of this, you learn some big words. The other day, I learned some new words from Ray. He's not here, but about diamonds. After I preached on it at the end of the sermon, he said, well, you did pretty well, but here's some other words you can add, like scintillating, okay? Scintillating. If you want to know about that, talk to Ray. But they call this spherical aberration. There's your new phrase for the evening from space, or from telescopes. Spherical aberration. When they made the Hubble telescope, of course, they used mirrors and not lens per se, but one of the main mirror that powers the telescope was curved in a way that was off. The curvature was off on one side. Now, they said like about less than the size of a human hair. I mean, it didn't take much, so that the images they received from space initially were highly distorted. And the whole thing was just kind of a bust. And people started making fun of it. They wrote cartoon jokes about it. It was a big deal for a while in the United States culture. Made it into the 90 to 91, 92, until they eventually sent a mission to install eyeglasses. They didn't replace the mirror, they put eyeglasses on top of the telescope. Now, they're not actually eyeglasses, but that's how we would think about it. That's the difference here. The fact is the same. They're hearing the same message. It's the cross. It's a crucified Messiah. The difference is in how you see it. And here it's a big difference. It's not a little less than a human hair. But it's still the idea that the way I see it, the lens or the glasses I have on, changes everything. Look at verse 19 now. He says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." And then these rhetorical questions. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? As if the Holy Spirit's saying, come and stand here. He's calling them into order. Come, where are you? What happened to you? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And as you read these terms, foolish and wisdom and weakness and power, it is not so much that he's saying that the things of God and the cross is actually foolish, as much as that from the world's perspective, it's all about perspective. It's all about what worldview you're using. What eyeglasses do you have on? It seems foolish. It seems ridiculous. And so if God could be foolish, his foolishness would put to shame the greatest philosophy and wisdom that the world produces. And it is not so much a critique of reason and logic as that God used something we would never reason out or logically expect to save us. He used something that some people see as scandalous, some people see as silly, and some people see, and that's your key word, as salvation. Salvation. Look at these next few verses. By the way, this is some of the best written material ever. And you don't know because it's not spelled out, but you kind of wonder, is there some humor here, some irony here that is meant to further bring home the point? Because Paul writes in a way that is very sound rhetorically. I mean, this is, the best orators in Corinth and philosophers could not write something as well put together and structured as this whole paragraph. Now, again, it's not really Paul, okay? But I almost wonder if there's some humor in that, right? But he says this, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach." And it's not here that it's preaching itself per se, although some preachers have been accused of being foolish and preaching a lot of foolishness. It is that the content that is preached, what we preach, he says, to say the folly of what we preach, to save those who believe, those who are converted. And now in verse 22, for the Jews demand signs. You might even think back to Jesus and his ministry when they come and ask for a sign. Give us a sign from heaven. And what does he say? Well, you're going to receive a sign, but not the kind you're asking for. It's the sign of Jonah. They demand signs. We need to see something. We've got to have a miracle. And you might even think today of modern versions of that, built on hype and the supernatural and the new and fresh, some new power, some new miracle. The Jews, he says, they demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. They seek that logic and philosophy, things that at least sound good to the ear, things that would create a following in Corinth. But we preach Christ crucified. That's the summary of the message of Christianity, of true Christianity. We proclaim, we herald, we preach Christ, the crucified one. Christ crucified Messiah. And he says, because of that, it's a stumbling block to the Jews. It's a scandal to them. This could point back to passages even under the law. Deuteronomy 23, cursed is anyone who's hung on a tree. It could just be that You preach a message about your king. Here you go, Jewish recipients, your king that you've been waiting centuries for, he's been born. Eve was promised, and Jewish girls were wondering, would I be the one to bear the coming one? He came, and the Romans executed him. Publicly humiliated and executed him. And the Jews are thinking, he's the one that's supposed to be killing the Romans, right? I mean, not the other way around. So don't say that. And I don't know in our culture, because we don't have a shame and honor culture like they did, I don't know that we struggle at least to get this, how this is the kind of thing you don't even want to talk about. The Romans would say, you don't mention the words crucifixion in public society. You don't even talk about it. It's that shameful and horrible. And so he says, to the Greeks, it's this scandalous thing, to the Jews rather, and then folly, if you keep reading, to the Gentiles or to the non-Jews. And in both cases, you could add the parenthesis here to non-believing or non-converted Jew, and then non-converted non-Jew. It gets a little repetitive, I guess, but that's how they see this. Maybe the best comparison today would be, what if you went around and you saw a very ornate building, and on top of it is the statue, let's say, or the shape of an electric chair? What would that be like? You see what I'm saying? You go around this town, and there are ornate buildings with what on top? With a cross. And we wear them around our neck. We put them on pictures on our wall. And what if you walked into somebody's house and they had this beautiful picture of a hangman's noose with the gallows and maybe even the silhouette of someone hanging to death? Now, you can take that a couple of different ways, and some people think maybe I shouldn't wear a cross around my neck or maybe the point is what Jesus, the meaning of his execution, what that did, even through the centuries as a culture, that we don't think anything about it because he took something so ugly and humiliating and painful, excruciating, from Latin for out of the cross, that kind of pain, and also turned it into something that is divine wisdom to save broken humanity, divine power to rescue us from our failings. He took something so ugly and shameful, they say don't even mention it in public, and made it beautiful, and now we put it on top of our church buildings. Look at what he says in the rest, verses 24 and 25 now. But to those who are called, when you read that, you might think converted. It's people who've answered the call. Both Jews and Greeks, Christ, he says, is the power of God and wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This challenges us in what we put our trust in, our security in life. It challenges us in how we see being successful, how we see power, prestige, prominence. But it also, and if you're filling out the handout, it also comforts us, because this calls us to see through the cross. Not just how I see the cross, but to see the world through the cross, so that even the negative things, like my disappointments and my struggles, my pains, my failures, those things I see differently. Partly because, from the worldly standpoint, the Messiah being executed publicly by the Romans outside of the city of Jerusalem, that is failure of failure. That's weakness and humiliation and foolishness. But in reality, God used that. That weakness was true power. That silly, scandalous thing was the wisdom of God to save humanity, seeing the cross. Now, because of that, verses 26 through 31, we are now boasting in the cross. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine the team goes home with the championship trophy? but not a single member of that team ever set foot on the championship field. What would that be like? Or the runner, I guess he's not a runner in this case, but let's say the marathon pedestal. And a man approaches and he stands on the first pedestal and receives the gold medal, and he never ran at all. What would that be like? When it comes to Christianity, we see this call here that God, he says, not many were called of this, but God chose so that nobody would boast. And you can go back to 1 Corinthians 1:9, where he called you into fellowship. You can go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the call of the gospel. God calls through the gospel the people who respond in faithfulness to that message, the people who see the cross for what it is. Those people then are the called of God, the chosen of God. Look at what he says in verse 26. Consider your calling. Have you done that lately? For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. And that's also when you can filter that through our society. Overall, things haven't changed. Especially in our country, we don't put so much stock in noble birth. Or at least we say we don't, right? We still have generations and generations of people that have a certain superiority, at least in their perception. Political power is a big deal, and politics and money and fame, they just tend to still go hand in hand together. And the world says that's who you want to be. That's what? That's being somebody. And we've created recently a cult of fame. There are people that are famous because they're famous. That's what we're doing right now with the whole influencer thing. And I'm not saying it's wrong per se, but it's a symptom of a cultural change where people are popular because they're popular, and they change how other people dress and where they go to eat just because they're on social media. He says not many people like that were called by the gospel. That's not saying that you can't be a Christian and be wealthy or be successful or be someone who, in their culture, let's say, was of noble birth, born to be king. But most people that are receptive to the gospel are the nobodies in this world. And maybe it's because, one, seeing the cross helps me to be humble and not see myself as a somebody. Maybe it's also that I'm more ready to see the cross properly when I'm not too busy looking at my own achievements. And the less achievements I have in the worldly perspective makes it easier. Look at verse 26. He says, or verse 27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world. How many Christians in the first century were slaves? Think about that as one example. Today, how many Christians are the people that are at the top of the tabloids as a more modern example? God chose what is low and despised in the world, even, verse 28 says, the things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. Or even, he chose things that people don't even notice, so it's like they don't even exist. The people and the environments that people don't want to talk about. Think of the people that Jesus attracted. The sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. And the gospel went into communities like that and changed everything, turned everything upside down. And now Paul, a few decades later, writes and says, people respond to the gospel, and God works in that through his power and wisdom, and it takes the people and the things that are practically nothing in the world and uses that to upend things that are, make them inoperable or useless. And I put down the pattern, and you can compare Romans chapter 8. There's a pattern here that builds in verse 30 from wisdom that in context seems to be about salvation and the way I live life for Jesus. And then sanctification, where now I'm really being changed and transformed. I'm being made holy like Jesus is holy. And then redemption here may look forward to the final redemption, to what Paul will call the redemption of even our bodies one day in Romans chapter 8. Earlier, actually, in Romans 8, in verse 22 and 23. Because he says here that he did all that so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. You get the wisdom and redemption and sanctification, the power and wisdom of God. You get to stand on the podium and receive that, and you didn't do anything to earn that. So that you can't then stand on the pedestal and go, look what I did. Because you're in Jesus, now you're somebody for real. Look at verse 30. And because of him, you are in Jesus, Christ Jesus, who became to us. And here's those steps: wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification, and redemption. So I'm made right. I'm changed to be right. And now he says, with all of that, so that, as it is written, let the one who boast, boast in the Lord. The calling, the pattern, and now the boasting. He quotes from Jeremiah 9, when Jeremiah says, don't let the person who's rich or strong or wise, even the people who are that, don't have any call to truly boast in that. But let the one who boasts boast in that he knows me. Here, take your boast, or even your rejoicing in the Lord. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom. To quote Galatians 6:14 here that parallels nicely, I'm not going to, far be it from me to boast in anything except Christ and his cross. So mark it down tonight. You don't have to measure up. That's on the second page of your handout. You don't have to measure up to anything. You don't have to reach a bar that God holds out and says, jump as high as you can, hope you make it. Or I guess you could say a bar and it's like limbo, you got to make it under without hitting the bar. You are not in competition with anyone, any other Christian, any other human being, anyone on this earth. Not in competition with them. But as one who in verse 30 is in Jesus, if you have been, go back to verse 13, you've been baptized into the name of Jesus. You are in Jesus. You belong to him, just like Paul and Peter and anybody. If that's true, then you have been. You are welcomed. That's your word, welcomed. Regardless of your background, your genetics, your finances, your social status, none of that. You're welcomed and transformed in him. And that just reminded me of the word. The word out beside that, you're going to flip the handout back, I guess, is status. Boasting in the cross says, my status as a human being is not based on any of those other things, the worldly success and wisdom, any of those things. My identity, my status now is that I am in Jesus. And because Jesus is the embodiment of God's wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, those things belong to me now. Not because I on my own am a somebody, I'm a nobody who gets to be somebody because of Jesus. Boasting in the cross. Now here's the last one for the evening. 1 through 5 of chapter 2, sliding over the chapter break, proclaiming the cross. In one word, mission. We are converted, and now we have a status in Jesus as we move forward, but we have a mission to share his name. I also read about a church, and over one of the archways in a courtyard between a couple of their parts of their facilities, they put this message. It's actually from 1 Corinthians 1. We preach Christ crucified. I think that's verse 24 of chapter 1, right? We just read a minute ago. They took that phrase and said, we preach Christ crucified, and put it over the archway. And then the ivy began to grow. And I think this is just a story, okay? But as it was told, as the ivy grew from right to left, it seemed that the message and the work and the worship of the church grew with it. Or I suppose you could say it digressed as the ivy grew. We preach Christ crucified. So the ivy first grows over crucified. And now it's just we preach Christ. And that works, but if you take it as just that, and as this went on, the church began to focus more on Jesus as a good teacher. He's got some good things to say about your marriage, and he can help your life, but that was it. And then the ivy grew more, and so now it's we preach. They were still saying things and doing things. They were still doing church. They still had a message, but Jesus fell away along the way. And then the ivy kept growing until they were left with the word, where are we? We. And they had evolved, as it were, into just a group of people, like a club where they met and they talked and they visited and somebody got up and spoke. But something had changed. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, 1 through 5, we see that this is not about the messenger. It's not about the method you use to share the message, whether publicly in a sermon or more privately in a Bible study. It's about the message, the message. Christianity, or our work as the church, is not about personalities. Ever seen that happen where there's one personality or even a set of people and they die or they move on or the church splits and everything falls apart because all the eggs were in the basket of a person, a personality. It's not about that. It's not about programs. I'm not saying that having programs or something like that is a problem, but that is not our focus, or shouldn't be. It's the metric, right? What metric do you use for being a successful church? Is it how many people you have? Is it how many programs you're running and how many things are being done? Is it a performance? You don't have to go very far to find a church that will give you an entertaining performance. No, it's about a proclamation. Let's read the first few verses and then we'll close. He says, "And when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he never preached anything else. If you read the rest of the letter, he preaches and teaches on many things, including the resurrection of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4, the ascension of Jesus, that same chapter, the proclamation, Jesus is Lord, chapter 12, verse 3. It's almost that maybe this is the worst part, though. If you're looking for worldly things, you're looking for things that are appealing and entertaining, Christ crucified, that's the worst and most opposite thing to anything like that. We preach Christ crucified. He said, that's all I was going to tell you, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So that our last takeaway line this evening is that our work as God's people is centered. You could even use the word focused. You don't have a screen to follow, so pick a word. Centered works for me, though, on Jesus and His work. And how dare any of us ever began to drift, ever began to push, ever began to focus on something other than Jesus and what He has done. When I do that, I might begin to boast in something else. I might begin to see things in a way that is not through the lens of the cross. Seeing the cross means that I'm now boasting in the cross because I am proclaiming the cross with my words and with the way that I walk through life. That's the call of the gospel, is a call to come to true wisdom and power. The cross is a message that saves us from our sins, but it is also intended to be a message that shapes who we are, that we become who God has always wanted us to be. And then we're somebody indeed. So come, obey the gospel this evening. Come and be reminded and renewed in the gospel of Jesus. There's a preacher from time past. Jerry Jenkins is his name, and he was known to say this phrase. I don't know that it originated with him. He was saying this as a preacher, but I suggest we can all say it as Christians, that I'm just a nobody, trying to tell somebody, or to everybody. See, I can't get all these bodies right. I just ruined it. I'm a nobody, trying to tell everybody about a somebody, capital S, who can save anybody. Let's stand and sing together.